Sign it, Zaina, or your brother will be out on the street by midnight. Voice of Director Lee was a jagged blade cutting through the sterile, air-conditioned chill of the luxury hotel's back office. Zaina Duncan looked down at the gold-embossed marriage contract, her vision blurred by hot, stinging tears. She was only 18, a waitress who spent her double shifts trying to stay invisible just to survive the city's grinding poverty. And yet, she had become the only currency left to pay for a debt her employers had recklessly gambled away. Across from her sat Taemin Jisoo. They called him the Cobra of the underworld. His sharp, angular jawline was as lethal as the criminal empire he ruled with a hand of ice. His steady, intent eyes tracked the frantic tremble in Zaina's hands, which were still stained with the soap from her last shift. He didn't look like a groom. He looked like an executioner waiting for the final signal to strike. "Please," Zaina whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the intimidating room. "I'm just a waitress. I don't belong in your world." Director Lee didn't care. He reached out, his fingers clawing toward Zaina's shoulder to force her head down toward the ink. But before he could touch a single strand of her neat braids, a sound like a gunshot echoed through the hollow room. It was the sound of Taemin Jisoo's hand slamming onto the mahogany table. "Touch her again," Taemin rasped, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that turned the very air in the office to ice. "And you won't live long enough to see the first debt cleared." The room went deathly silent. Director Lee and the hotel owners, the people who were supposed to protect their staff, glanced at each other, their greed momentarily masked by pure terror. They thought they were selling a disposable girl into a life of torture to save their own skins. They'd whispered for weeks that she would be a broken toy in a golden cage. Zaina believed them. She expected a nightmare of blood and iron. What they didn't know yet was that the most dangerous man in Korea had been watching Zaina Duncan from the shadows for months. They didn't know that the Cobra had been waiting for this exact moment to claim what he believed was his. And her employers, they had no idea that by giving her to him, they just handed a flamethrower to the man who was about to burn their entire corrupt world to the ground. Wait until you see what happens when Director Lee realizes he didn't sell a slave. He created a queen. Before we continue, I would like to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments and also subscribe to this channel. Your support means a lot to us. The black sedan moved through the city like a silent predator, its tinted windows shielding Zaina from the world she was leaving behind. Beside her, the two guards remained as unmoving as statues, their presence a cold reminder that she was no longer a person, but a high-value asset being delivered to its new owner. As the car wound its way up a private, pine-lined road, the iron gates of the Jisoo estate groaned open, revealing a fortress of white stone and dark steel perched over the gray sprawl of the city. It was beautiful, but it was a beauty that felt like a warning. Zaina stepped out of the car, her legs feeling like water and her breath hitching in the sharp mountain air. She expected a dungeon, but she was led through a foyer that stretched toward hand-painted murals and crystal chandeliers. The silence of the mansion was a physical weight, pressing the air out of her lungs as she was led toward a set of heavy walnut doors at the end of a long, echoing hallway. The study was bathed in the warm orange glow of a fireplace, but the heat didn't reach the man sitting behind the massive desk. Taemin Jisoo didn't look up immediately. He was focused on a series of documents, his pen moving with elegant, lethal precision. In the flickering light, his sharp jawline looked as though it had been carved from obsidian. He carried the weight of 1,000 years of cold authority. When he finally laid down his pen and looked up, Zaina felt the full force of his gaze, steady, intent, and impossibly deep. "Shaking," he said, his voice a low, dominant vibration that seemed to hum in the very floorboards. I don't want to be here," Zaina whispered, her voice cracking as she clutched the modest fabric of her uniform. Taemin rose from his chair, his athletic frame unfolding with predatory grace as he walked around the desk. He stopped just inches from her, the scent of sandalwood and cold rain enveloping her. He was nearly a foot taller, his broad shoulders blocking out the light of the fire. "You think you have been brought here to be punished," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the weary set of her shoulders. You think I am the nightmare your employers whispered about. Zaina looked up at him with a mixture of defiance and terror. Aren't you? They say your word is law. A ghost of a smile flickered across his lips as he reached out. Zaina flinched, but his hand didn't strike. Instead, he gently tucked a stray braid behind her ear. I break things that are meant to be broken, he said softly. But you are not one of them. He turned to the window, watching her reflection in the glass. You are my wife now, Zaina. In this house, no one can hurt you. The first week in the Jisoo estate felt less like a marriage and more like a fever dream. Zaina lived in a suite in the East Wing that was larger than her entire apartment, a space of silk sheets and heated marble floors. But the luxury felt like a heavy shroud. She spent her days wandering the vast, silent corridors, waiting for the Cobra to strike. She expected the cruelty director Lee had promised, but Taemin Jisoo remained a ghost in his own home, appearing only at dinner to watch her with a clinical, detached intensity. The room she had been given was a masterpiece of cold opulence. Every morning, silent staff laid out clothes that cost more than a year of her previous wages, cashmere sweaters in soft creams, silk slip dresses, and jewelry that sparkled with a predatory light. There were vanity tables topped with crystal bottles of perfume and shelves lined with books she was too anxious to read. Yet, for all the gold and velvet, the air felt thin. There were no photos on the walls, no sounds of laughter, just the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a countdown to a confrontation that never came. She spent hours by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city she had once struggled in. From up here, the world looked like a toy set, and she felt like a doll placed on a shelf by a collector who hadn't decided what to do with her yet. The isolation was its own kind of violence. Without the noise of the hotel kitchen or the constant demands of her younger brother, the silence allowed her mind to spiral into dark corners. She wondered if this was the mercy Taemin had spoken of, to be kept in a cage so beautiful she would eventually forget she was a prisoner. On the fifth night, the silence was finally broken. Zaina was in the library, trying to find a distraction from the grief and fear that sat like a stone in her chest. She reached for a book on the top shelf, but her fingers slipped, and the heavy volume crashed to the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Panic surged through her. In her old life, a mistake like this was met with a sting, and she braced for Taemin's anger. Instead, she felt a shift in the air. Taemin was standing in the doorway, his silhouette blocking out the light from the hall. He hadn't made a sound as he approached. I'm sorry, Zaina whispered, her hands shaking as she clutched the book. It was an accident. Zaina. His voice was a low, dominant vibration that cut through her frantic apologies. He walked toward her with predatory grace, taking the book from her hands and setting it aside. He didn't yell. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. You are trembling over a piece of paper and glue, he said, his eyes searching hers. Did they make you this afraid of mistakes? Zaina looked down, her warm brown skin flushing. I don't know what the rules are here. There is only one rule, Taemin said, stepping closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his broad chest. Do not lie to me. Everything else is negotiable. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the cold luxury. If the room feels too large, we can change it. But do not mistake silence for absence, Zaina. I am always watching. The charity gala for the Seoul Foundation was Zaina's first mandatory appearance as the new Mrs. Jisoo, and the air in the grand ballroom felt thick with judgment. Clad in a gown of midnight blue that contrasted beautifully with her warm brown skin, she felt like an exotic bird trapped in a cage of glass. The elite of the city moved in synchronized ripples of silk and hushed Korean, their eyes darting toward her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Taemin stood by her side, a silent, towering presence in a charcoal suit, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. He spoke little, but his gaze never left the room, scouting for threats Zaina couldn't yet see. The crisis struck an hour into the event. A server, flustered by the aggressive demands of a high-ranking board member, tripped near the main buffet, sending a cascade of red wine and crystal onto a display of priceless artifacts on loan from the National Museum. The room went deathly silent. The board member began a shrill, public berating of the trembling server, a scene that threatened to turn the prestigious evening into a scandal. Zaina didn't wait for Taemin's permission. While the socialites whispered behind their fans, she stepped forward. Her years in the hotel trenches had taught her that chaos was just a problem waiting for a solution. With a calm that seemed to radiate outward, she stepped between the shouting man and the terrified boy. "Sir," she said, her voice low and steady, cutting through the man's tirade. "The artifacts are protected by hydrophobic coating. The wine won't settle if we act now. And you," she turned to the server, placing a stabilizing hand on his arm, "get the salt and the white linen from the service station. Now." She didn't raise her voice, but she commanded the space. In a few swift, efficient movements, she directed the cleanup, diffused the board members' anger with a diplomatic nod, and restored order before the museum curators could even reach the scene. It was a display of quiet resilience that left the room stunned. Taemin watched from the shadows of a marble pillar, his glass of scotch forgotten in his hand. For the first time, he wasn't looking at her as a nobody he had rescued or a piece of property he had acquired. He saw the sharp, tactical mind behind those expressive eyes. He saw the way she handled pressure, not with the loud arrogance of the Mafia, but with the surgical precision of a leader. As she returned to his side, slightly breathless, Taemin leaned down. The coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a flickering, genuine heat. "You handled that with more grace than anyone in this room is capable of," he whispered, his breath ghosting against her ear. "I chose you for your strength, Zaina, but I think I've underestimated just how much of it you have." For the first time, the hand on her back didn't feel like a restraint. It felt like an anchor. The warmth of Taemin's praise still lingered on Zaina's skin as they moved toward the terrace, but the evening's peace was short-lived. A shadow detached itself from a group of elite socialites, drifting toward them with the grace of a swan and the intent of a predator. It was Min Jin. Dressed in a gown of shimmering silver that looked like liquid moonlight, she was the embodiment of the world Zaina was supposed to fear. "Taemin," Min Jin purred, her eyes sliding over Zaina as if she were a smudge on a pristine canvas. "A lovely performance by your ward. It's truly fascinating how the help can be trained to handle porcelain. Though I suppose a waitress is accustomed to cleaning up messes, isn't she?" A few nearby guests stifled laughs. Zaina felt the familiar sting of shame, the old instinct to shrink back and become invisible clawing at her throat. She felt the weight of her background, the waitress label being used as a brand of unworthiness, but the hand on her back tightened. Taemin didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Min Jin at first. He continued to watch Zaina, his expression unreadable until he finally turned his head. The air around them didn't just chill, it died. "Min Jin," Taemin said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that silenced the surrounding gossip instantly. "You speak as if you are standing on a pedestal, but you are standing in my house at my event, insulting my wife." "Taemin, darling, I was only—" "You were overstepping," he interrupted, his tone as sharp as a razor's edge. He stepped forward, his towering athletic frame casting a long, dark shadow over the former fiancé. "Zaina Duncan has more courage in her silence than you have in your entire lineage. She is the woman who wears my ring. She is the woman who carries the Jisoo name." He looked around the circle of onlookers, his dark eyes flashing with a lethal, jagged light that made even the most powerful men step back. "Me be exceptionally clear so there is no confusion in the morning," Taemin announced, his voice carrying to the corners of the ballroom. "Zaina is not to be touched. Not with your hands and certainly not with your tongues. To insult her is to declare war on me. And I believe you all know how I finish my wars." Min Jin's face turned a ghostly pale as she realized the Ice King had found something he actually cherished. Taemin didn't wait for her apology. He turned back to Zaina, his features softening just a fraction, a secret meant only for her. He offered his arm, his movements courtly and protective. "Come, Zaina," he murmured. "The air in here has become stagnant. Let's find somewhere we can breathe." As they walked away, leaving the elite in a state of stunned terror, Zaina realized for the first time that she wasn't just a girl in a velvet cage. She was a rose protected by a blade, and the world was finally learning to stay back. The following afternoon, the Jisoo estate was eerily still, the only sound the distant, rhythmic chime of a clock. Taemin had been called away to a high-level meeting with the syndicate elders, leaving Zaina to wander the sprawling halls. Drawn by a strange pull of curiosity, she found herself standing before the heavy, mahogany doors of Taemin's private study, the one room he had told her was strictly off-limits. The door creaked open, revealing a sanctuary of dark wood and the scent of old paper and expensive leather. It was a cold, masculine space, but as she moved toward a recessed wall behind his desk, she noticed a keypad hidden behind a sliding panel. Recalling the date Taemin had mentioned during their first dinner, the day he claimed his life had changed, she punched in the numbers. With a soft click, the wall pivoted to reveal a hidden archive. Zaina's breath caught in her throat. She expected to find ledgers of blood money or blueprints for criminal expansion. Instead, the walls were lined with sketches. She stepped closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. They were portraits of her. In one, she was leaning against the counter of the hotel coffee shop, a stray lock of hair falling over her eyes. In another, she was walking home in the rain, her head bowed but her shoulders set with that characteristic, quiet resilience. These weren't the hurried drawings of a stalker. They were the meticulous observations of an artist or a devotee. Pinned to the center board was a series of handwritten notes in Taemin's sharp, disciplined script. October 14th. She gave her own meal to a homeless man behind the kitchen. She thinks no one sees her beauty, but she is the only light in this gray city. Another note, dated months before their marriage contract was ever drafted, read, "Director Lee believes he is selling her to me. He has no idea I have been waiting 3 years for the right moment to burn his world down and bring her home. She is not a transaction. She is the architecture of my salvation." Zaina staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. The Ice King, the man the world feared as a monster, hadn't just bought her to settle a debt. He had been worshipping her from the shadows, documenting her every struggle and triumph long before she knew his name. He hadn't trapped her in a cage. He had built a fortress to keep her safe from a world that had never known her value. As she looked at a sketch of herself smiling, a rare moment captured through a window months ago, she realized that Taemin Jisoo didn't want a slave or a trophy. He wanted the woman he had been loving in secret, the only person who had humanized the monster before he ever touched her hand. The Viper wasn't her captor, he was her most loyal subject. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the estate, but the atmosphere remained charged with the weight of the previous night's revelation. Zaina had barely slept, her mind spinning with the images of those charcoal sketches, the proof that she had been cherished long before she was bought. When Taemin appeared at her door, he wasn't wearing his usual boardroom armor. He looked relaxed, yet his eyes held a predatory gleam of intent. "Ready?" he commanded, though the edge of his voice had softened into something resembling an invitation. "Today, we remind the city who you are." The shopping trip was not a casual outing. It was an act of lavish, aggressive warfare. Taemin didn't take her to a mall. He had the most exclusive boutique in the Cheongdam district cleared of all other patrons. As they stepped out of the armored sedan, a line of attendants bowed so low their foreheads nearly touched their knees. Zaina felt the old instinct to apologize for her presence, to shrink away from the opulence, but Taemin's hand was firm on the small of her back. He directed the creative directors with the same lethal precision he used to move syndicate assets. "That," Taemin said, dismissing a rack of delicate pastels with a flick of his wrist. "She is not a girl to be pitied or hidden. Bring the silks that command attention. Bring the diamonds that cut." For hours, Zaina was draped in fabrics that felt like liquid moonlight and structured blazers that felt like armor. Taemin sat in a velvet chair, a glass of dark tea in his hand, watching her with an intensity that made her skin hum. Every time she emerged from the dressing room looking unsure, he would rise, adjust a collar or a necklace, and lean into her ear. "You spent your life making yourself small so they wouldn't hit you," he whispered, his reflection behind hers in the three-way mirror. "Look at yourself, Zaina. You were never small. You were just waiting for a stage big enough to hold you." By the time they finished, the boutique staff was frantically packing dozens of high-end trunks. Taemin didn't just buy clothes, he bought a transformation. As they exited, the paparazzi, tipped off by the sheer scale of the disruption, began snapping photos. In the past, Zaina would have shielded her face. Today, she looked at the flashes with her head held high, her warm brown skin glowing against a deep emerald coat that cost more than director Lee's entire hotel. Taemin stood by her side, his presence a silent warning to anyone who dared to look at her with anything less than reverence. As the car pulled away, Zaina realized the lesson wasn't for the city, it was for her. She was no longer the waitress in the shadows. She was the woman the Cobra had chosen to stand beside him, and for the first time, she believed she was worth the throne. The sanctuary of the Jisoo estate was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon, a day that began with the deceptive calm of a fatting summer. Taemin had been lured to the docks on the pretext of a shipment seizure, leaving Zaina under the watchful eye of a reduced security detail. It was a lapse in judgment born of a newfound softness, a crack in the armor of the man who had once been untouchable. Director Lee had been watching that crack grow. From the shadows of his failing hotel empire, he saw the way the Cobra had begun to linger at the breakfast table, the way his lethal focus was now divided by the woman who shared his name. To Lee, it wasn't romance. It was a tactical weakness. Taemin Jisoo had traded his fangs for a wedding ring, and it was time to show him the cost of such a trade. Zaina was in the garden, a sketchbook in her lap as she tried to replicate the charcoal lines she had found in Taemin's study. The scent of blooming jasmine was suddenly replaced by the sharp, chemical tang of a rag pressed hard against her face. She struggled, her fingers clawing at a pair of gloved hands, but the world began to tilt into a sickening gray. Through the fog of the sedative, she saw the polished shoes of Director Lee standing over her. "Girl who became a queen," Lee sneered, his voice a distorted rasp in her ear. "Let's see if your king values his empire more than his pet." By the time the alarm was raised at the estate, the garden was empty. The only trace left was Zaina's sketchbook, its pages fluttering in the wind, showing an unfinished portrait of Taemin. Across the city, in an abandoned warehouse that smelled of salt and rot, Zaina woke up bound to a rusted chair. The luxury of the emerald coat she wore was a stark contrast to the grime of her surroundings. Director Lee sat opposite her, flanked by a group of mercenaries whose loyalties had been bought with the very debt Taemin thought he had settled. "He's coming for you," Zaina whispered, her voice thick and raspy, but her eyes held a spark of the resilience that had first caught Taemin's attention. "And when he finds you, there won't be enough of you left to bury." Lee laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the corrugated metal walls. "He's a businessman now, Zaina. He has too much to lose. I'm going to make him choose his territory or the waitress, and we both know what the Cobra values most." He didn't see the way Zaina's chin lifted. She knew something the director didn't. She had seen the sketches. She knew that to Taemin Jisoo, she wasn't just a part of the empire. She was the only thing that made the empire worth having. And she knew that the man coming for her wouldn't be the businessman, it would be the monster. The shipyard was a skeleton of rusted iron and salt-stained concrete, shrouded in a fog that swallowed the city's lights. Inside the warehouse, Director Lee paced with a frantic energy, his eyes darting to the heavy steel doors. He expected a negotiation. He expected a fleet of lawyers and a briefcase full of deeds to settle the debt once and for all. He did not expect the silence to be broken by the sound of a high-performance engine screaming toward the pier, followed by the deafening, rhythmic thud of a flashbang. The world turned white. Before the smoke could clear, the doors were torn from their hinges. Taemin Jisoo didn't enter like a businessman. He entered like a force of nature. He was a blur of lethal, kinetic violence, moving through Lee's hired mercenaries with a terrifying, practiced efficiency. There were no warnings, no demands, only the cold, precise sounds of a man dismantling everything in his path to get to the center of the room. Taemin stopped 10 feet from the chair where Zaina was bound. His charcoal suit was ruined, his knuckles split, and his eyes, usually so controlled, were burning with a raw, unhinged desperation. "Merger, Taemin," Director Lee shrieked, pressing a jagged shard of glass near Zaina's throat as he backed away. The board is waiting, the signatures. If you take one more step, you lose the Jisoo legacy. You lose everything you've built. Taemin didn't even blink at the mention of his empire. He didn't look at the director. His gaze was locked on Zaina, taking in her bruised cheek and the defiant set of her jaw. "Let her go, Lee," Taemin said, his voice dropping to a low, guttural growl that made the very floorboards vibrate. "I've already burned the merger. I walked out of the boardroom an hour ago." "Do you think I care about a throne if she isn't sitting on it beside me?" Director Lee froze, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He had gambled on Taemin's greed, but he had ignored the man's heart. You threw away the acquisition for a waitress." "I threw away a pile of glass for the only thing that is real," Taemin rasped. In a movement too fast for the human eye to follow, he closed the distance. He disarmed Lee with a sickening crack of bone, throwing the man aside like a piece of refuse. He didn't check to see if Lee was breathing. He fell to his knees in front of Zaina, his trembling hands fumbling with her restraints. As the ropes fell away, Taemin pulled her into his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He was shaking, the untouchable Cobra was shaking. "I'm here," he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking with a vulnerability he had never shown the world. "I've got you. You're the only reason I'm still living, Zaina. The only reason." Zaina clung to him, the scent of sandalwood and gunpowder enveloping her, realizing that while he had saved her life, she had saved his soul. The aftermath of the shipyard reckoning felt like the clearing of a long, toxic smog. Taemin did not simply return to his estate. He moved with the cold, systematic fury of a man ensuring his world would never be threatened again. Standing in the center of the Grand Jisoo boardroom, Zaina stood by his side, no longer in her modest hotel uniform or even the emerald coat of a victim. She wore a tailored suit of ivory, her head held high, her presence a calm anchor to Taemin's lethal energy. Director Lee was brought into the room, not as a peer, but as a ghost of a man stripped of every asset he had ever touched. "Every hotel, every contract, every cent you leveraged against Zaina's life has been absorbed," Taemin stated, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that brooked no argument. "You didn't just lose a business deal, Lee. You lost your right to exist in this city." Taemin turned to the board of directors, the men who had once whispered about the Black Waitress with sneers and skepticism. He didn't have to speak loudly to command them. He simply placed his hand on the back of Zaina's chair as she sat at the head of the table. "This is Zaina Jisoo," he announced, his gaze daring anyone to blink. "She is the architecture of the new Jisoo Empire. Her word is my law. If you find that difficult to process, you are welcome to leave, if you can find a way out that doesn't involve the police." By one, the elders bowed. It wasn't the bow of a forced transaction, but the deep, respectful inclination of men who recognized a new power. Zaina looked across the room and realized she didn't feel the need to hide anymore. The quiet resilience that had once been her survival mechanism had evolved into the poise of a matriarch. As they walked out of the boardroom together, the staff and the city's elite stood in the lobby, parted like the Red Sea. For the first time when they spoke, they didn't whisper about a debt or a waitress. "Good evening, Madam Jisoo," a high-ranking official murmured, bowing his head in genuine deference. The sound of her name, coupled with a title of such weight, sent a shiver of victory through her. She looked at Taemin, finding him watching her with that same profound, quiet pride she had seen in his secret sketches. He had burned the world to keep her safe, and in the ashes they had built something unbreakable. Zaina was no longer the girl afraid of the shadows. She was the light that governed them. As they stepped out into the crisp evening air, she knew she would never be invisible again. The Cobra had found his queen, and the empire was finally at peace. This story of Zaina and Taemin proves that true value is never determined by the title you hold or the uniform you wear, but by the strength of your character when everything is taken away. Taemin Jisoo didn't fall for a waitress. He fell for the girl who remained kind in a cruel world and stayed resilient when she was meant to break. He realized that an empire is just a cold collection of stone and steel, unless it is inhabited by someone with a soul worth protecting. The ultimate victory wasn't the diamonds or the ivory suits, But the moment Zaina stopped looking for an exit and started realizing she was the one holding the keys to the kingdom, it serves as a reminder that those who try to trade you like a commodity will always be destroyed by the fire of the. If you enjoyed seeing Zaina rise from the shadows to claim her throne, make sure to like this video and share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own hidden strength. We release new stories of high-stakes romance and billionaire justice every week, and you won't want to miss the next chapter of the Jisoo legacy. Click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell to join our community of story lovers today.